is a little dark. I don't know if you could increase
now
your
we're
lighting.
live.
That's my skin.
That's his skin.
Oh, well, no, I think it's there. Yeah, you turn the light on. That's better.
All right.
Yeah.
Hey, everyone out there in the world. Welcome to the Living Mystery Symposium Day 3 panel discussion, taking your questions with, let's see who we have here from top to bottom. Whitley Strieber, aloha. Lahua Lopez, aloha.
Aloha back to you.
Me squinting at the computer, aloha, everyone. Dennis McKenna, aloha.
Aloha.
Teokas and Ghost Horse, aloha. And Jeffrey Kripal, aloha.
Aloha.
So what we're going to do here is I would love to talk amongst ourselves for a little bit, and then I have questions from the audience that have already come in. And if anyone out there watching, at least on YouTube Live, has questions, you can put them in your chat. I think you can do that on Facebook Live also, and I will be able to read them. So if you have any questions as we go along, audience, feel free to ask them. First, I want to just thank you all for having done this and given your time and all of that for free. Very much appreciated. Not just by me, but people out there in the world have loved this. So thank you for doing this. And thanks everyone for showing up. I guess I have a question, really, maybe Jeff Kripal or Teokasin or Dennis McKenna could take this, which is when you do conferences, because I know at least you three do a lot of conferences in front of scholarly groups and all of that. I mean, the rest of us have done things, but it's not usually geared toward that. Are you there to learn from each other, or are you just there to give presentations, or what is your sense of what you're getting back from the experience as opposed to what you're putting into it? Don't make me pick someone. Go ahead, Jeff Kripal.
Okay. So I guess that means I have to say something.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I normally lecture to academic audiences, and but they're also non-academic audiences. They're publics. They're different kinds of publics, as I would describe them. And I get a tremendous amount out of traveling and talking to different publics, because it's a good barometer check for where people are at in different cities, different states, different countries, different parts of the world. So certainly it's a two-way street, to answer your question, Jeremy. I'm there to give a lecture, but it's really because that's what they asked me to do. It's not because I want to hear myself blab.
Right. Well, so when you're as you've watched some of this stuff and listened to the speakers, have you learned anything from any of this?
Don't put him on the spot.
Is that
I'm going to put all of you on the spot.
Why do I have to answer all these questions? Of course I learned a great deal. I had never listened to Teokasin or to Lahua. I know Dennis and Whitley, but I learned something from them as well. Of course, I always learn a great deal.
That was very specific. Thank you. Dennis McKenna.
Yes, sir.
What about you?
I'm on the spot.
Yeah, what would you say has been your takeaway from what you've watched of the presentations?
Well, it's they've all been very interesting. I think you've got a diverse set of topics here and points of view, which was not exactly what I expected this conference to be. But I'm delighted with the way it worked out. I got a chance over the last few days, last couple of weeks, to look at everyone's video. Jeffrey's talk about Nietzsche was, of course, really interesting and familiar territory for him. My talk about the origin of consciousness, you all know that shtick. And the dialogue between Lahua and Teokasin was also very interesting. Less focused around a a central theme maybe than some of the other talks, but nonetheless very interesting. And a lot of things they talked about resonate with me too. I think, the conversation about how out of sync we are with nature and how we've really lost this connection to nature, which is the root of a lot of our problems, no doubt about it. So, I rave about that too. And I think anybody who thinks about the the crisis that we're in on a planetary scale and the erosion of traditional knowledge that is happening just at a point when we really need to be trying to recover it and honor it and understand it more, because indigenous people have been around long enough that they, I think they have a better sense of how we fit into the natural order, and this is something that as postmodern Western non-indigenous people, it's something that we need to acknowledge and learn from. We have a preoccupation, I think, with scientific knowledge and technology in the West, and that's okay. But we have this idea that that's going to save our ass, as it were. I don't think so. So we've got some waking up to do, and so this conference has brought all that into focus for me.
Lahua, I see you reacting. If you want to jump in.
Yes. Oh, thank you for letting me jump in. Dennis, let me take this opportunity now to invite you to spend a long conversation with me at Jeremy and Carol's house on Hawaii Island, because there's a hell of a lot we need to talk about. You compared cultural and indigenous narratives and myths to science. That's like comparing apples to pineapples. Indigenous peoples have their own knowledge based in the facts of what they saw, what they experienced, how they experienced it, when they experienced it, and they recorded this knowledge. Way back in the very early 1800s, maybe the late 1700s, there was a botanist who came to Hawaii, and when he showed natives citrus plants, they took the leaves, they turned it over, they turned it back, they smelled the orange, and they said, we have similar plants, because they too collected evidence and data about their own native plants. They recorded it in chants and those so-called myths, passed it on, and we had that whole body of knowledge. How the hell do you think we were able to develop indigenous medicines without gathering evidence, gathering data, making decisions, proposing hypotheses, creating experiments, and seeing what happens?
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. All right. I get it.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
And you're completely misinterpreting what I'm saying.
What are you saying?
Well, I certainly
I
would
agree
not.
with Casson entirely,
Yeah.
and color entirely. But that's
I would say that indigenous people are acute observers of their environments. They're experimentalists. They practice a kind of science. It's not science the way we think of it, but it's an empirical observation of the world and integration of that into a worldview and knowledge base. And I am certainly not saying that science is superior to indigenous knowledge, not at all.
Thank you.
In fact, one of the things I think that scientists are deficient in and really need to be reminded of frequently is how little science really knows. Science can understand small portions of reality in great detail. They're not so good at putting the whole picture together into one holistic understanding, and that's where we can learn from indigenous people. But I would be the last person to dismiss or discount indigenous knowledge. For one thing, science as a discipline has been around since maybe, the 16th century. Descartes and the scientific method. Indigenous people have been around for tens of thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years, millions of years if you look at the evolutionary timescale. So I think we need to acknowledge that those folks have probably learned a thing or two,
Thank you.
that scientists are not aware of and could benefit from knowing. So
And that's the point I wanted to make, is the fact that you as a scientist acknowledge indigenous natural law and indigenous science is something that the vast population of the United States, including the people who are probably checking in right now, have no idea. They still see natives the way they see them on TV and in movies, as these savage, primitive, drum beating, peace pipe smoking, hula dancing, people.
Well, can I jump in? And I just want to ask Dennis, because it seems to me it would be helpful to differentiate what you presented as the scientific orthodox view of things versus what Dennis McKenna actually believes. So I just want to ask, is there a difference between your own personal and what you presented? Because I thought there was, but I wasn't sure.
you're asking me?
Yeah, in your presentation, you gave sort of an orthodox scientific kind of, view of evolution and of. So I thought you were speaking from that point of view, which didn't necessarily reflect how you actually see the world.
It doesn't necessarily reflect it, but yeah, it was from that perspective, and the point I was trying to make, in my presentation on the origins of consciousness was a couple of things. Number one, how do you define consciousness? This is a tough thing, and Jeffrey probably has a lot of ideas about this. But for the purposes of argument, I was suggesting that consciousness in humans, I mean, animals may have a kind of consciousness, but I think it's not as developed as humans. And I think the thing that makes consciousness, or that is a characteristic of that state, is the fact that we can construct this internal map of the world, which is basically an abstraction. Neuroscientists now call it the default mode network, but it's not. I call it the reality hallucination. And we take the information from the outside world and combine it with associations and memories and whatever comes through our neural receptors, our sensory receptors. We kind of mix all that together and extrude it, if you will, into a model of reality that works for us, and that works more or less. But it is not reality; it's a model of reality, and the human ability to create this schematic, if you will, of reality that's internalized is what I think characterizes human consciousness. And then my own ideas about the role that psychedelics, particularly mushrooms, may have played in this process. That's a whole other conversation. But I don't, so that's where I'm at with this.
Okay. And Whitley, you wanted to jump in and say something?
No, that's okay.
Okay.
I'm sorry, Whitley. I didn't mean to talk over you last time. Feel free to jump in.
No, I'll just say one thing. We haven't got the slightest idea of what animal consciousness is. What you're talking about is the apparent difference in intelligence, and I'm not even sure we know what that is. Mm-hmm. So to characterize human consciousness as being somehow more rich or better than animal consciousness is premature.
Well, we don't know what possibly indigenous people, through shamanism and so on, they probably come the closest to being able to experience what it is to have that animal perception. What I venture to say, though, that is in human consciousness is symbols and abstractions and visual representations internal imaginings that have meaning characterize human consciousness, and then that's reflected in what we put out into the world in the form of artifacts and written records and this sort of thing. But that doesn't mean that animals don't have consciousness. They just don't express it the way that we do. And so that's I'm not putting down animals or indigenous people or anybody. I'm just saying we have uniqueness.
We haven't any idea about the minds of animals at all.
Yeah.
No. And we think or we imagine that the mind that evolved after we began to write things down is even the real human mind. And I'm not so sure that's true. I think history is a journey down a lost path, Western history especially. And if, as far as indigenous people having no science, I would suggest looking at the various artifacts of the past that we no longer understand, which are very many, that we have lost real science. And that would be why the science we have now is leading this planet pell-mell toward an uncontrollable extinction event, because it's not science. It's something else. I don't know what to call it, because it works, though, doesn't mean that it's science. Science, I think that we have no choice but to look back to the indigenous populations of this planet to find out what their vision of reality is in order to determine who and what we are. And if we don't do that, the species is going to fail.
Tiokasin, where are you with all of this?
I'm right here. Thank you, both you, Whitley, and Dennis, and Jeffrey, for being here. It's an honor to be among you all and bring these perspectives to those who are listening to us. I do think that, yes, indeed, we are all indigenous in the beginning. I think we have gone astray with learning that the original path for all of us was learning how to live with the earth. And I may speak in these terms, but you have to understand this is my second language, and I have to conceptualize much of what I have to say from the beginning to the end. That way I can present it to you in noun form. And so when I'm speaking the language where my people are from, it's more that we are describing the motion of something, and then we describe the energy of the motion, and that's our language in Lakota. So therefore, it removes the subject, the object, the objectifying process, and we see the energy of all. And I say see, but that kind of cheapens what is really happening when I'm speaking this language in English. It's like it's coming from a sort of a I would say, dare say, it's an immature process to say, I declare something to be provable because we've enforced it with the gun and God and whatever else we're doing to say that the world must think this way. The world must have our psychologies about domination, where most of these indigenous languages that I know of through my travels of 40 years is that there is no word or concept for domination. And so when you're in relationship with all, that means the distant stars to that micro that we understand as the atom and the vibrations of that as well as a star. So it seems very superfluous the way I'm speaking here, where in the reality of who we are as beings, we do know we have a relationship and a consciousness with the earth. And that vibratory being of who we are also feeds you the knowledge, and if not the information, the data, and if not the wisdom, then it is the experience. Because I know once we all arrive at a place where we either satisfied or undersatisfied, then we start comparing and measuring who knows what and why, and and then we just isolate ourselves even further. And so ours is about the relationship with all, not the connection. And when I think about, I've read all of these books, and yet the earth leads me back to who are we? And why do we have to go to Mars and applaud ourselves for flying helicopters on Mars? Is that technology, or is that just the technical human doing rather than the organic human being that we all stem from? So when I put my garden in the ground, see, I have to own it. And I say and yet it's not the garden that I grow the garden grows me. And that's where all the intelligence comes from. The right food feeds the brain, and feeds the various parts of this body. So that's the consciousness of the earth. And we can't separate that to say, well, we can say this is provable and therefore we'll write a book. But that sells only in 12% of the world is stemming from European descent. But 96% of its psychologies are enforced on other peoples. So we have to talk this language, we have to go to their schools, we have to live their way, and that's all enforced with domination, you see. And you find the cause and effect world is less so in indigenous cultures. So the symbiotic nature of who we are is always looking for that balance, with our domination that is ego-fed from domination says that we must have it this way, when it's neither surrendering or defeat. It's always in a relationship. And as you use this fluffy word called harmony, right? It's all that romanticized view of who we are, and the reality of experiencing the earth and that intelligence from the plants, the trees, the rocks, the water. All that gives us the intelligence enough to know that whatever comes here from another place in the universe, it's the same nature, you see. So we can't separate that. I'm not saying anybody's wrong or right here. It's just I'm telling you an experience passed over from my elders. That makes any sense.
Yeah. Well, and Jeff, let me ask you a question that should maybe go to Whitley, but let's give it to you because, you've studied religions and modes of spirituality around the world.
Anything, so.
Well, I just want to ask, in terms of when when Tiokasin's saying whatever is out there is, we're all still a part of the sameness. When you think of, because I already know Whitley doesn't believe in aliens per se that are interacting with him, but a presence, a something, a someone who seems strikingly familiar, but yet is their own person. Given what you've studied your whole career, at least, is that the picture you form? Like when you think of abduction experiences, or when you think of UFOs, or even think of aliens on another planet, do you, I guess just based on sort of everything that you've taken in, do you see them as alien and other, or can they never be that?
So we're moving into a different topic, right? I mean, that seems
Yes.
like a very different question than what Tiokasin was talking about. So let me back up a bit, Jeremy. So first of all, I'm not sure. I mean, what I think is really not the most important thing. The most important thing is I live and work in a university that is a global community. It's a private university, which means we can pretty much ensure complete or a very significant human diversity. So every classroom I enter feels like the UN. There are people from all over the world, all walks of life, all ethnicities. There's no clear majority in a typical classroom, and my job teaching comparative religion is not to prioritize any particular culture or any particular religion, but to help people think about human diversity, but also human sameness. You know, and I think this is the challenge that we're really struggling with here is how do we talk about our cultures and ourselves in a way that honors our differences, but also honors the way we're similar. This came up in the discussion between Lahua and Teokasin with this notion that we all have 5 fingers on our hands. You know, we have different origin stories, we have different creation stories, but we essentially all share the same biology. And I think this gets to the science question too. I'm going to get to your answer, Jeremy. I think this gets to the science question. You know, people from all over the world come to my university to study physics or chemistry or biology, and that biology or that physics works the same in every culture. And presumably it also works the same on other planets and even other star systems. So there is something special about it that's not specific to a culture or a language or a community. And I think that's what draws people to the sciences. And I'm speaking as a non-scientist here. But I really do see that as a different form of knowledge than indigenous knowledge or, you know, some kind of religious knowledge, be it Buddhist or Hindu or Christian or Jewish or whatever it is. When we get to the alien question, which is what you're really asking me, I think these tensions between sameness and difference really are important, because abduction experiences look to me like classical religious encounters with what previous cultures would call angels or demons or gods or jinn or witches or what have you. And it's framed differently, and it's actually also experienced differently because of the cultural context and because of the world we live in. But there's definitely a sameness there that's ancient. And there's also really important differences that I think are because of our cultures and our languages and frankly our scientific knowledge. You know, we think of these experiences differently because we live in a cosmology that supposes a big bang and billions of galaxies. Our ancestors didn't have that. You know, they had a different cosmology, but they didn't think in those exact terms. So as a result, we think of these things differently.
You know,
So that would be how I would answer it, Jeremy.
I believe that Jeff has the remarkable flexibility to see these things in more than one way at the same time. For example, he knows perfectly well that my experience of contact and that of many other people left me with physical injuries. And yet, I wouldn't disagree with what you just said at all. There's a book, incidentally, that Jeff wrote a foreword for called The Idea of the World, a multidisciplinary argument for the mental nature of reality that I think gets into why it would be there isn't a contradiction between those two things. There only appears to be one. So I'm perfectly comfortable living with the notion that I have had alien contact and that is indeed essentially a psychological and cultural response to something that is, I call now the present, because simply because we don't understand it. And I must say though that in my life experience there are people who do understand, and I find them again and again in indigenous cultures around the world who have long ago integrated this strange contradiction into their worldview in extraordinarily subtle ways. And when I look back at the lost past, I think to myself, these are people who long ago developed highly sophisticated ways of looking at what is real. And we've lost that. And we've put a kind of set of blinders on. We are addicts. We are addicted to the belief that the material world is real. And I'm not sure that's true at all. My wife, who was so brilliant, said, and I think this is so fundamentally true, the human species is too young to have beliefs. What we need are good questions.
Good question.
Modern science is simply, in my mind, another religion that has sacraments that can express into the world around us outcomes that appear to be real. But that's only because they appear to be real now. 2,000 years ago, I can assure you, other very different scientists were doing the same thing in an entirely different way. We can see the results of that in what I regard as the last document known of an objective science of the soul, and the first religious document, which is the pyramid text and the Pyramid of Unas. Now, you can on the west wall of that pyramid, you can find out more about the connection between the body and the numinous world than you can in all of the modern literature on consciousness. I think, and of course, for someone who's interested in hieroglyphics, if you are interested in hieroglyphics, you will find that the concretization of the words in that pyramid of the hieroglyphics into a modern translation limits them fantastic. The actual hieroglyphics are extraordinary puns on nature that extract subtle relationships between various natural phenomena and natural powers and apply them as an underlying meaning to the word, and that's all lost in translation. But it's marvelous material. Okay, well, I don't want to go on at length, especially in such an obscure way, for which I apologize.
Okay. Well, I know Lahua has a question.
I have to jump here in, Jeremy, and just say, make a couple of remarks here. I don't necessarily want to be the defender of the last bastions of science. I think that science has great value. I think that most people misunderstand science and what it really is, and I think part of that is the result of the cultural context in which we experience science. And people think that science is about proving things. Actually, science is about disproving things. That's the way it works. If you truly approach scientific investigation in a open-minded way, the science constructs hypotheses. It constructs suppositions about the way things are, about particular phenomena, and so on. You can create those hypotheses, and then, if you're honest about practicing science, you try like hell to disprove those hypotheses. That's where the discovery comes. You don't accept it. You don't use all science. Science never proves anything. It can only say, based on what we know, we cannot disprove this or that hypothesis or supposition. And that's a fundamental aspect of science that, to my mind, is extremely attractive, because it never, if it's properly pursued, it never degenerates into dogma. Now, I realize in the actuality, in the practice of science, this is often not true, because scientists are invested in their institution and the prestige that goes with being a scientist and being a successful investigator with grants and graduate students and all that. So there's an incentive to lose sight of the fact or ignore the fact that in its purest form, science is an attempt to discover truth about the universe. That's easily obscured, but that's in its purest form. That's what it is. And, it's a tool that's very powerful because it gives you a way to ask questions of nature and get answers back that you can accept provisionally, always provisionally, based on what we think we know. And that's a whole other conversation. Or you can say, well, this just does not fit with the current picture. That doesn't mean it's wrong. It just means that either the current picture needs to be revised or maybe chucked out the window entirely and a new model constructed. But that's what science does. It creates models about the way things are, and then it tests those models. And I'll get off this pedestal for a minute, but I also wanted to say something about experience, because we're talking a lot about experience when we're talking about consciousness. I think a prime premise when we talk about experience is that if you and Whitley was talking about reality. Reality is a very stretchy term, that can fit into a lot of different contexts. So I would say that it's important to remember that anything we experience is real, and in fact, experience is all we have. Our experience of the world, experience is what we have. It's real in that you experience it. It is not necessarily correspond to something out there that's real. It could be in here. And again, out there, in here, these are very tricky, stretchy terms that we use thoughtlessly, and this is one of the one of the useful lessons that psychedelics, again, and there's other ways to do it too, but psychedelics can help us understand that these distinctions between the inside and the outside are really artificial constructs. We are all one, right? I mean, everything is connected. We're all part of something, and the boundaries that we think we perceive are constructs of our minds in a certain way. Now, they're useful because they help us navigate in the world and and be functional, but we shouldn't necessarily take them as true in all instances. So anyway, that's
Go ahead.
Yes, I have a question for Jeff. Back at the beginning of this discussion, both Jeremy and Dennis brought up the idea of the whole picture. And the whole picture, whatever it is really important if we're going to talk about consciousness. But I want to ask you specifically what you think and how you describe what we are now talking about in terms of the whole picture. What are the elements of it for you? And is it only science that helps you define, quote, the whole picture of human consciousness? I use the word human, leaving aside animal for the time being. Jeff.
So thank you, Lahua. So first of all, I'm not a scientist. I'm just describing how science works at a university and how people from all over the world come to do it. So I think it is actually really special, and I think it is different than other forms of religious knowledge or cultural knowledge. Having said that, I've given my life to religious forms of knowledge. I don't think science is the only way to know the world or to know what a human being is. And what I've really been drawn to is what we might call comparative mystical literature. In other words, literature from around the world, from every culture, that describes some extreme or extraordinary state of union with the world, with the deity, with the gods, however that's framed. So the whole for me, the whole is always relative, right? I mean, that whole I'm speaking of is really the history of religions in a kind of global scale. But the planet Earth is just one planet in a, you know, in a galaxy, and it's billions of galaxies. So it all depends on what our whole is here. But my whole is humanity. That's why I spoke about the humanities in my talk, and I'm trying to understand why human beings are so different, but also why they're so similar. So that to me is the whole, and it's
So,
that balance.
so does the supernatural, the paranormal, high
Absolutely.
strangeness, does that all come in for you for the whole?
Listen, I'm Professor Paranormal. You're talking to him. You know, that's
Ah,
what I do. That's my thing, Lahua. That's what I'm trying to get my academic colleagues to take seriously, is things they have not taken seriously for about 120 years. And my whole purpose in my little tiny professional corner is to get academics to take the supernatural, the paranormal, the anomalous, these high stranges, however you want to frame it, as real human experiences that have philosophical import, that mean something, and that we
so
should
do
think
you
about.
Right.
so do you believe that there's more than one reality that exists? Or is it simply this reality that you're seeing at Rice University when you go into your
Of
classroom
course.
with your
No, of
UN
course.
students?
No, of course there are more realities. I
Oh,
wouldn't do what
good.
I do if I thought there was just this one, you know, screen, or this one reality.
I
That's
couldn't disagree more, Jeff. Sorry, I gotta. There's only one reality. It's just that we comprehend fragments of it.
I
We
think
don't.
that's what
That
Lahua
was
is
the
saying.
point I was trying to make. Is that we're not
Yeah.
good at apprehending these wholes and putting all the pieces together. But and you know, something is paranormal or supernatural or anomalous only until it's understood.
Oh my God, Dennis, when you come to have that conversation with me at Jeremy and Carol's house, I am also going to take you on a mystical journey through this particular island and the volcano and blow your mind apart. Period.
Well, I'm not saying that, you know,
Jeremy,
it necessarily is going to fit into the framework of what I think I know, and I'm always revising that. I'm just saying that when something is understood, I mean, essentially what I'm trying to say is there's nothing outside of nature, you know, and once we understand a phenomenon, a paranormal event, or some of these things, then it's not supernatural anymore. It's an aspect of nature. That doesn't necessarily mean that we thoroughly understand it or that it loses its you know, power to impress us and puzzle us.
Whitley, do you
Yeah,
believe that there's nothing outside of nature?
well, I don't know what nature is, but I am fairly sure that underlying everything is a level of indeterminacy, and I can that we're not necessarily able to determine to tell what reality is, or even whether or not we're part of some kind of absolute reality. And I can give you an illustration of why I think that. There's a philosopher called Edmund Gettier, who in 1963 published a short paper which was very influential about something that came to be called the Gettier paradox. And to sum it up very simply, this is the paradox. Let's look at a problem known as the cow problem. A farmer has a cow that he thinks may be ill. It's a Holstein, black and white. He puts the cow in a field by herself so that he can, while he works in his barn, glance into the field from time to time and see whether or not the cow is struggling. The cow in the field, there is a tree and there's a little hollow. The cow wanders into the hollow. At the same time, a piece of black and white paper blows in and lands under the tree. The cow is perfectly fine. The farmer looks into the field, sees the black and white paper under the tree, and thinks to himself, well, my cow is fine. He's wrong. He hasn't seen his cow. He's right. His cow is fine. I would suggest that this is the fundamental human predicament. And when you look at the deeper indeterminacies that are suggested by physics, by the double slit experiment primarily, I think my only answer can be that we don't know what nature is and can't know what it is.
All right. Well, maybe this is where I jump back in. I'm going to switch over to listener questions because we have more than I have on my sheet of paper. If that's okay with everyone.
Sure.
Good? Okay, cool. So the first one is pretty easy here. It's for Jeff from Bellahorse, asking how one can access Whitley Strieber's collection of received letters at Rice University. So tell everyone what that is and if they can
Sure.
access it.
So I think I can answer that fairly quickly. And of course, Whitley's right here too. Whitley was kind enough to donate to I'm building or helping to build what we're calling the Archives of the Impossible, which are a series of collections of mostly ufological collections, but also remote viewing and anything involving the paranormal or the supernatural that you were referring to earlier, Lihua. Some of these collections are fully archived and are accessible to the public. A few of them are on moratorium and are not accessible because of the wishes of the donor. Whitley's collection is not in moratorium, is one of those that is accessible. Unfortunately, you have to come to Rice to the Woodson Research Center to access it. You have to engage it physically. We have not scanned any of these collections yet, largely because we don't have the resources. And these archives involve literally hundreds of thousands of documents and objects. So that's a quick answer to that question. So you can come, Bellhorse, you can just come to Houston, come to Rice and study the letters there. We haven't even counted them yet. We think there are between 4,000 and 5,000 of these letters, which were from individuals from really all over the world, mostly written to Whitley in the late 1980s and early 1990s, but also extending further than that, about their own abduction accounts or their own encounters with what they believed was a UFO.
Okay. Well, now I'm going to go to my handy-dandy sheet. I'm sorry, I thought Lihua was typing, but someone's typing and it's coming through on the speaker. If whoever that is could mute, and I hope my typing isn't coming through on the speaker too. Probably is. Let's see. So I got some questions from the weekend, and I will ask the first one to Tiokasin from Darlene, asking, saying, I thought it was interesting that Lihua told a myth of creation involving bundles. In the Lakota myth of White Buffalo Calf Woman, she gives the people a sacred bundle. The stories have their differences, but did Tiokasin note that, or did this resonate with him? The notion of bundles, does that resonate with you?
Yeah, it did. It did. Excuse me. It did. I think bundles is sort of a all-encompassing word that says it's full of instrumentation. It's full of knowledge. It's a library. It's an instrument that to learn how to live among the other imaginations, the ideas, the intelligences that are available with Earth. And so in that way, what we say is that this appeared in the bundle is part of the ceremonies we have as Lakota people, that we talk about the creation story in all of our ceremonies, the 7 that we have. It always involves the origin story, you see, which in the Western world they would call myth. But you have this recently as 2,500 years ago, and that story has not changed among the Lakota people. So you can't, basically devolve from that story, that origin story, because all of those iologies, I would say the ologies, the biology, the chemistry, the physics, all were encompassed within that bundle to give us and keep us, I would say, on the road, so to speak, to Chakuwankan, which is the red road, which is leading to the intelligence that she had brought for us. So it's not so much that it is just a physical thing, but when we have these ceremonies, it's represented in the chanupa, or the pipe. And so you have this quantum physics understanding that something is so simple and it carries this intelligence with it. So these beings that were involved in the bundle are actually being used today. And that's what I'm saying. How does one who speaks a non-scientific language, non-rational language, be able to put it into a language of such rationality? And just to go back to the Mitakoe Oyasi, which is which people say is we are all related, but it's much more than Mitakoe Oyasi. It's the medicine that confronts what was involved in the papal bulls that came here in 1493, that basically involved saying "Scientio dominate," is that to rule through science, to rule through authority, which is religion, science, and government. And that authority has no relationship. It's always above and over. And that's basically what has happened since 1493. And since we don't have a word for religion, you can't put it in a category of those religions, because we don't, it's a way, it's kind of saying that we don't have a word for freedom, because that's what we are, was being free. So we don't necessarily need the word. So these are still in action. They're actuating as we go now, because they are our musical instrument, as you would say, to make sure that we are understanding these deeper intelligences that are non-human. I can only say that much about it so far.
I'd like to add one more thing to the dismantling of the word bundle. And in my story, that also includes gift giving, because gift giving is extremely important in starting, maintaining, and continuing both relationships and connections. So the word bundle has within it a huge amount of mystical, spiritual, and practical reasons.
Thank you.
May I add?
Yes, go for it.
Okay. In the summer of 2019, I spent a short amount of time on the Lakota Sioux Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, during which time I had the most extraordinary experience of my life. If you read my books, you will find I've had a lot of extraordinary experiences, to say the least. There are even some people in this group who believe that, but not all. And I was living both in this universe and in a parallel, or perhaps a mirror universe, at the same time for 3 days. And it was an extremely powerful and detailed experience. When I closed my eyes, I didn't experience the darkness of closed eyes. What opened up was an entirely different world that was superimposed on this world and connected to it. The strangeness became so high that, for example, when we were at the Wounded Knee memorial and I was looking down at the graves, a man kept walking up to me and then walking back and walking away. And he finally came up to me and said, "Mr. Strieber, what are you doing?" I said, "Well, I was thinking about this catastrophe, this terrible tragedy, and this awful crime." And he said, "Because when I walk up to you and look down, I can see inside the graves. I can see the bones." And I couldn't do it, but it was something near me that was causing all of this strange stuff to happen. I would submit to you that I was living
Mm,
in a science of the distant past that still exists
mm,
in the DNA and in the
mm,
mind and consciousness of the Lakota people in
mm,
that poorest of all counties in the United States, struggling with crime and drugs and alcohol and everything that we have visited upon them. There is still something there that
mm,
is perhaps more alive than anything that those of us who are ensnared in the bear trap of Western thinking can imagine.
mm, mm,
It's very true, Whitley. Thank you for that. There's such a thing that doesn't exist, and I can say this from my mother. I think the word is pareidolia, that we don't see things only through human eyes, you see.
mm,
And so when those so-called dimensions open up to you, you're speaking that language, and that language has nothing to do with an alphabet or concept or domination, because you have to be related, mitaku oyasi, in order
mm,
to go past the religious context of anything and domination and authority. Because who is the authority? We don't know. And when I hear stories like this, I only have to agree. I don't have to nod my head because I actually feel the energy from you. And that's how we begin this. I said, I see you, I hear you, and I feel you. Because it's that wave. It's that wave that you saw there. And those seers who know that. And it's just not some woo woo, right? This is reality to a lot of us that the modern world and Sciencio Dominate do not understand, because they want to have authority of it and prove it or disprove it, as we heard. And so when I'm thinking, well, should I continue telling stories about these so-called quote unquote supernatural experiences? And someone said it too, that we don't have superstition or supernatural, because once you have natural, then you're also in the rhythm of the intelligence of the earth, which in this case, the white buffalo calf woman, which would bring that knowledge and information, intelligence, so that we as human beings, in this case a Lakota, could learn how to live in peace with the earth rather than the domination on it. That was the biggest difference. Thank you for that.
Well, it certainly wasn't pareidolia, which is the observation of a pattern that seems meaningful where none actually exists.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, it did exist. It does exist. In fact, it exists so much that once I had been in it, I learned to go back into it. I went into it physically twice. I wasn't, I don't know how I did it, but I did it for very brief moments. I won't go describing that, it's pointless. But I did learn to look into it. As a result of doing this too hard, I lost a lot of the vision in my right eye. So if it wasn't a physical experience, I guess I was wrong. And pareidolia can reach out and bite you afterward.
Mm-hmm. Crazy Horse is one of the ancestors that you can think about all the visions, or the Hamblietches, the vision questing and the ceremonies that have been performed with the land, not on the land, but with the trees, with the animals, with the air, with the consciousness of the rocks and the water, with the fire. So when we understand that, we can say that what Crazy Horse said once was, he said, we live in the shadow of the real world. And he's talking about where you just described, Whitley, is
That
that's
speaks
what
to
we.
me. That really
Mm-hmm,
speaks to me.
mm-hmm. And where is the language available for that? That is what I've
mm,
been talking to others, younger folks around the world as well, because I go to those places of their history, of their stones, of their cultures, of what's left of them, and try to bring that into, and non-comparably, into what I already understand from my people, which is very little, by the way, but it seems to be that origin seed that we all have kind of left aside because we are so um, into this domination that we all been forced to think, even feel, and we put our energies and we're not using our energy properly, well, Earth will put you into your place, and that's what I'm saying. It has nothing to do with being humility or anything like this. It feels just right, and these experiences are the same experiences maybe they're having someplace else on the Earth or with the Earth, and so I would only describe it that much. Yeah.
All right, should I go to the next question? Everyone's good? Okay. Pamela Grundy asks Dennis, if the shared reality hallucination is a map of what's out there, what is the status or function of the imagery that comes from within? How do internal states change our external map? Which I guess are two questions.
Well, I think consciousness is a combination of consciousness. This reality hallucination that we construct is composed of information that comes to us through our sensory neural interface, our sensory receptors, essentially, from the quote unquote outside world. You know, you always have to use these words provisionally because our perception is that it's outside, but maybe there is no such thing as outside. But setting that for the moment aside, you get the information that comes from what we perceive to be the world around us, but then that becomes processed within our brains. It becomes processed through memories and associations and other kinds of internal structures. So it's like you take the raw material of perception and you kind of put it into a big blender internally, and you throw in those perceptions, your expectations, your memories, what you have learned through living and experience, mix all that together, mix it up, you know, turn on the blender and extrude out of that, in a sense, a model of your experience. This is the idea. So you can't separate them. All of these elements come together to create the model of the world that we inhabit, which we assume, we don't really know because we can't really see ultimate reality directly. That's the whole point. But the model that we inhabit corresponds to apparently enough that we can share these perceptions and we can navigate through the world. But it's also impoverished in a certain sense. I mean, what the brain is a receptor, but it's also a gate. And in order to create this model reality, it has to filter out a great deal of information, which is not that it's not important, but that in order to make sense, it has to be ignored. Essentially, create a background that we, it's there, it's available to perception if we look for it, but usually it's in the background. Our focus is on something more front and center, or the focus of our attention is our experience of being. And this is how we construct it. There's a term for it in neuroscience, which is called neural gating. And Aldous Huxley talked about this in The Doors of Perception in the same framework. He talked about the reducing valve, that the brain, in a lot of ways, its function is to filter things out rather than let information in. It functions to exclude information, which does not mean that it's less important. It just means that it's less accessible to perception and experience. And you can tweak it. There are psychedelics, other kinds of spiritual practices are based on the idea that you can open up the reducing valve or you can disable the reducing valve. And then information comes through that normally is excluded because, it's just not convenient in a sense, or it's not part of this model reality that we need to construct. And what we call ordinary waking consciousness is, an impoverished consciousness in a certain way. But we can, we know that we can open up those gates or disable those gates. And I think then perception becomes very different. And I think that indigenous people, and to a certain extent children also, have much wider gates. They have not constructed these exclusionary mechanisms so much. So that's why a child or an indigenous person can be in a natural environment and perceive things about it that we adults, particularly we Western, scientifically literacy conditioned adults, it's opaque to us. It's not accessible. So that's the that's the context. I think that if you go into nature with a child or an indigenous person who is pre-literate, they're going to see that environment very differently than we do, and they're going to see aspects of it that we have no idea, because we're so conditioned to exclude those things from our experience. So then we create this sort of reduced model of reality, which is where we exist most of the time, until certain special moments when we begin to realize, well, that's actually a very, that's not the complete picture. That's a very impoverished view of reality. I mean, it's like looking at a map as opposed to looking at the actual landscape. So I think I answered that question anyway.
Thank you. Pamela also has a question for Jeff. Do you think cross-disciplinary work between the humanities and science could be beneficial in regard to the study of anomalous experience? And is the Academy working at all toward interdisciplinary inquiry, or is that off the table for the most part?
So the answer is yes and then no. I mean, yes, of course. I think, I define a paranormal event as something that's happening in the physical environment that corresponds almost perfectly with the subjective event going on in the mind or soul of a person. So there's a deep resonance between the subjective and the objective world there. And so to really study those things, you have to engage the sciences, which is I think our best method for studying the material world. But you also have to engage the humanities, which is one way of accessing or thinking about the subjective or the spiritual realm. So yes, I think that's one way forward. It's not the only way to study those things, but it's definitely the way forward in the Academy. But no, that's not being done. It's taboo. These things aren't supposed to happen. They're impossible. That's why I call them the impossible. But of course, they're only impossible in the categories of our present worldview. They're not impossible at all. They happen all the time. Exactly. That which makes them impossible is simply a function of our categories and our faulty worldview. And there is a kind of renaissance in my world of looking at these things by different people, particularly younger intellectuals. Also, by the way, from people who study indigenous cultures, there's a real interest in these sorts of things as normal, as natural, part of the world. So that's the answer to the question, Jeremy. Yes, I think we need at least a dual approach, and no, it's not being done because I think these things violate the basic structures of this Western metaphysic that we're living in at the moment.
So here's a question for Lahua from Tyler Kochjohn, who wants to know.
My friend Tyler.
Well, he starts off with a quote here from the 30-meter telescope website. And the quote is, "The TMT International Observatory will enable astronomers to see deeper into space and observe cosmic objects with unprecedented sensitivity, thereby making it possible to address fundamental questions in astronomy, ranging from uncertain star and planet formations to unraveling the history of galaxies and the development of large-scale structure in the universe. So his question is, will the promised contributions to the scientific canon compensate for the loss of sacred grounds?
No, no, it's how that knowledge was found that counts for us, not that it's found at all. Because there are other ways of finding out that very kind of knowledge that Tyler's talking about. The problem is this: Hawaiians and these particular Hawaiian activists up at the top of Mauna Kea are not protesting against science. They are protesting against development. They're literally saying these buildings, this steel, asphalt, concrete, this 6 acres of human-built environment is oppressing, literally pressing down and obliterating the sacred understanding of what we have up at the top of that mountain. It's the buildings. It's even if whether it was a parking lot or a golf course or a residential structures for Native Hawaiian elders with free medical care and free food, we would still be opposed to it. It is the instinctive sacredness of the mountain that's important to us. And science can find another way to get that kind of information. You don't have to sacrifice Mauna Kea for that.
Thank you. There's another part to his question, and this can go to anyone. Now, consider another situation that may seem unrelated: gain-of-function research with viruses. Proponents tell us such experiments are critical to prevent a pandemic, while critics fear an accidental laboratory escape of artificially enhanced viruses could create one. Gain-of-function experiments have been approved and conducted. Is it possible these situations, this and the TMT, are two sides of the same operational coin, the routine transgression of autonomy? Perhaps persons who felt no connection to a physical struggle over sacred lands appropriated to meet the requirements of the TMT, now following the debate on the origins of COVID, will realize how loss and risk factor in to the many decisions made on our behalf by the scientific enterprise. Does anyone want to take that just in terms of, are these two sides to the same coin of transgression of autonomy?
Nobody's jumping into it.
Go ahead, Dennis.
Well, I'm not sure how these things relate. I get totally what Lehua is saying, and yes, it's in some ways those sacred grounds should be left intact. You know, the point that you made is, at least if I interpret you correctly, it's not that building the TMT there is not to be encouraged. You're saying any human activity in that place is not desirable. It should be left as natural as possible. It should be left pristine. I can resonate with that. You know, as a scientist, I also think that, as I said before, I think science is in its purest form, it's the quest for truth. And I think that it's a quest to expand our knowledge of the universe. And so I support the idea of doing this astronomy, but maybe not in that place, and that's one of the maybe blind spots of science. We have to realize that it shouldn't take precedence over everything else, certainly we should pursue these kinds of investigations, but science has to be mindful of the way it impacts the rest of life, the rest of human culture, human civilization, and so on. And I'll shut up there. And I see Jeffrey has his hand up, so I'm gonna. he can take it from here. We can talk. We can talk on the other side, as they say.
Yeah, actually, I'm not sure anything I have to say disagrees with you, Dennis. I just want to add something from the history of religions and human storytelling that, humans have long seen danger in knowledge. In the monotheistic traditions, one of the first stories is basically a story about knowledge that results in this young couple getting banned from the Garden of Eden. And in the Greeks, you have Prometheus, the Prometheus story, and these stories of forbidden knowledge just go on and on and on, down to the modern world. So I don't know if that's helpful, but I think sometimes we believe that knowledge, whether it's scientific knowledge or other forms of knowledge, are always good. And they probably seldom are just good. They probably always come with moral ambiguities. I'm thinking, Dennis, of the way animals have been used in scientific research and the kind of ethical and moral codes we now follow. But I'm sure those aren't perfect. Or think about CRISPR and genetic modifications and whether we should be modifying the human DNA. I mean, talk about sacred ground. But people are doing that. They're going to do that regardless of what anybody says because they can.
Exactly,
And
Jeff.
yeah, and so I think these ancient stories of forbidden knowledge and the danger of knowledge are quite relevant, and that we should be struggling with this and not be issuing clear answers one way or the other. The telescope lahua, I have no trouble with your position on that. I think that sounds right to me as well. But I'm just saying there are other forms of knowledge that are going to be ambiguous, and we don't know. Here's the other thing we know about the history of science: we do not know what leads to surprising discoveries of things that are very positive. Sometimes very neutral things lead to very positive things, and I suspect very bad things lead to sometimes very good things. We just don't know.
Well, so Jeff, you stuck your finger right on a big issue here, which is that, as I often say in my public talks, our cleverness has far outstripped our wisdom.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is we have all this, we are very clever. Science is very good at being very clever, and technology as well. But what we lack, and what never can originate in science, what has to originate within the human heart, is the moral dimension. And there is no such thing as an evil technology. There's plenty of evil ways and not good ways to use technology. I mean, this comes up with respect to drugs all the time. It's all about, and so scientific discoveries and the search for knowledge should always be conducted in the light of the moral quandary that we face, which is a larger context, and the idea, and science is guilty of this because science is arrogant, but the idea that we will do this because we can is a very bad way to approach it. And it's not science's fault. It's the attitude of the people that do science. It's sort of we will use the Hadron Collider to create mini black holes, even though it might collapse the space-time continuum, but it's worth the risk, right? That's just
let's blow it
up. I mean, you have to have the wisdom to step back and say, we can do this thing, like CRISPR and this sort of thing. But should we do it? Is it the right thing to do? That's not something that's come from science. That's something that's going to come from our moral universe, I think. And so
there's an entirely different way of looking at this. I don't know if anyone else has read Roberto Colosso's book, The Unnameable Present. It's a a very different concept of the present reality. And in it, he makes the point that sacrifice, that is to say, animal sacrifice, has now become scientific experiment. But it's essentially has the same cultural function that it did in the past. It is there to enable us to change our situation in the world. It did not necessarily have expected results in the past as reliably as it does now. I mean, nowadays, if you experiment with a cosmetic on enough rabbits, you can sell that cosmetic with the assurance that it's not going to turn people's lips, cause people's lips to rot away. But in the past, we would sacrifice animals and, in fact, other human beings, which of course is done to an extent now, too, because you could say that astronauts who dare the edge and lose that bet are sacrifices, human sacrifices. So, you know, you can see it in an entirely different way culturally. We're not actually different from the past. We look upon ourselves as being different from the past, but that's only an illusion and it's arrogance. The truth is, we're doing the same thing we've always done, just over time, it has begun to work a little better in the sense that the outcomes are more predictable.
Okay. Whitley, Kelly Annette writes, hello, Whitley. Question from a longtime Dreamland subscriber and grateful reader / listener since 1987. Do you recall, and I believe it is your book Majestic and possibly elsewhere, one or more beautiful references to yellow flowers in association with the visitors? Would you expand on the flower symbolism / meaning? I ask as I am occasionally clairvoyant, and one of the things I see shortly after someone dies is a place that seems to be a transitional or early place one goes, in quotes, and often meets loved ones. It is a field with yellow flowers. I remember it was spine-tingling to see them in your writing.
Well, I've always thought of the field of yellow flowers as the place of transition, but of course it's only pareidolia since there is no afterlife. But I'm being very sarcastic here. I live with one foot in this life and one foot in another life, and no matter what, it's there. And I see that as that color and the little flowers are apparently the energetic borderline of transition. That would be what I would think. And you can live in both places at the same time. I think it's called, in some cultures, it's called shamanism, being a shaman. I'm not necessarily a shaman, but I still do.
Okay, and sort of a related question also from Kelly Annette for Tiokasin and Lahua. I hesitate to even ask this because this feels like it could be its own conference, but I'll ask anyway. Questions for both Lahua and Tiokasin. Grateful, thanks to both of you for sharing. I could listen to you for hours. 1, would you both be so kind as to share your words and their meanings for life and death? 2, do you both have stories from your ancestors of what happens or where one goes after death? Lahua? Maybe?
I'll take it first. Our word for life is ola. Our word for death is make. And yes, we have thousands of stories about life and death and what happens after we die and where we go and who we encounter and who we should encounter. In fact, Hawaiians talk about death among themselves. Well, actually, they talk about death with everybody they encounter more than any other people I've ever met. I think Jeremy and Carol may have heard me talk about death a hell of a lot because we don't understand death as being the end of this life. In fact, meaning the end of life itself. for this particular body. We see death as a transition for many other worlds. And yes, Whitley, we also have a world where we go to that exists between this life and the world of the ancestors, which we label as Po, P-O, with a go over it. And that in between world allows our souls to say goodbye, to interact, to give lasting understandings of the interactions between relationships that they had on this planet. And then they go to the world of the ancestors. And that for us is critical. We have many realities. And one of the realities we have is the world of dreams. In fact, anthropologists often say that Hawaiian culture is much more a dream culture than the real culture that Dennis is in right now. Our dream world is more real to us than Dennis's reality. And that brings in a whole lot of other kinds of understandings of what consciousness is. In the ancient Hawaiian world, we had languages that was only spoken during dream time, based in Hawaiian, but not with the kind of Hawaiian words and Hawaiian grammar that we use today. It was its own technical language that allowed dream kahuna, dream shamans, to interact with people who were in the dream world. We also have other kinds of languages, because I know, Tiokasin, that you brought up the idea about how languages, where the languages are available for the meanings that we need to know today. For us, the language of hula, dance, the language of chant, the language of music, and the language of our artistic endeavors. And for ancients, right up until this time, we have more than 3 million pictographs and petroglyphs that are far more recordations of what we know, how we know it, and where we know it, than simply rock art. So these different languages allow us to access much more of our world than what we know of today. And Dennis, Dennis, you have to promise me you're going to meet me in Hawaii with Carol and Jeremy,
If you keep
because
picking on him, he's never going to come here.
Oh, no, Dennis, please. I really want you to come. We have so much to talk about, including pre-literate.
Well,
So let's
I'd love to come. I will come one of
Good,
these days.
good, good, good,
Yeah,
good, 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 good.
yeah.
But let me give this over to Tiokasin.
Oh, I don't have much. You said everything there, Lua. Lua, it's that we respect death as much as we respect life. There is no, we could say there is no crossover, but we have to use that language where, when I talked to Whitley, I said our ancestors, who, by the way, go into the future, our ancestors go into the future, and this is what we follow, is that lineage of the elders. And so this is how we move forward in that emotion of it. And that when I said that we live in the shadow of the real world, you see, something is more, how do you say it, desirable or more approachable when there's something more, not better, but something more that we know you can go on with. And I don't know the English with this, but I do know that, we often use it in this context of English as forbidden knowledge, I think someone mentioned. And I always wonder why our so-called religion was banned until 1978,
Mm.
because it was, they saw things happen that they could not explain. Science or religion or governments could not explain that were happening. And what happened to Whitley was actually what was going on, to be in contact with those ancestors, to be in contact with the future is often that forbidden knowledge. We fear the future in this language. that we often give it up to the children, when the other ways is that no, the elders are the future. Without them, we cannot have children go into the future. So it's a different way of thinking. And I do say that, we speak of in great respect of death as we do in great respect of life, and there is no difference to us. So I can say that much, and because Lehua said it very much, I agree with. Yeah.
Well, that is our 90 minutes. So that flew by. I'm sorry for the couple of questions I didn't get to, everyone out there. But let's hope this is not the end of the discussion on diversity and consciousness, but just the beginning. I want to thank everyone for bringing your personal and your professional expertises or lived experiences to this, and for being, all of you, for being forthright and just doing this. I mean, this has been a real great learning experience, I think, for all of us. I don't want to speak for everyone out there, but definitely me. So thank you, Whitley and Lehua, Dennis, Tiokasin, Jeff. Much appreciated. And if there's anything that anyone wanted to say that I missed, or that you didn't get to say that's been burning, now's the time.
I just wanted to thank everybody for joining all of us. It's been such an exciting time for me to see and hear everyone for the last couple of days. It's been really, really wonderful, wonderful. Oh, and Dennis, when you do come, honey, bring your mushrooms. Please.
Bring my mushrooms. What? You
Yes,
don't have your own
please.
mushrooms out there?
No, I don't.
Oh, well.
No, Dennis. I am not about to go out into some field and find cow doo-doo and go pick my own mushrooms. Been there, done that.
You take me to Mauna Kea and show me the
absolutely.
supernatural.
Oh, my God,
I will take
yes.
you to the pasture and show you mushrooms. So
Thank you.
we
No.
can
You
share
have to
that.
go there and pick it and bring it back.
Yeah,
Yes.
absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Oh, and I'd like to open this invitation also to Tiokasin and Jeffrey and Whitley. I would love to see you guys at Jeremy and Carol's house to continue this conversation, because there's a lot more to talk about.
I wished we could have done this in Hawaii as we did last time. I mean, Jeffrey and Whitley and I and Jeremy had a wonderful conference a few years ago, and and I think that was the last time I was in Hawaii. So Jeremy, thank you so much for putting this together. This has been a great conversation. I've enjoyed every minute of it. Thank you,
Jeremy, also from me and everyone who came. I found it interesting and challenging and delightful. So thank you.
Yeah.
And I want to thank Carol Thong, my lovely wife, who refuses to come on camera. But thank you.
Our loss.
Yes.
Smart
and also
woman.
Joe. Yeah, well, there's that. And Joe Gooch for giving us the music. And the speakers have given charitable organizations and nonprofits for, if you feel like giving back to them on our behalf. So check out jaylonproductions.com, JAYLON productions.com, and you will find a list of those charities there. I urge you to do that. Thank you all again. This has been wonderful.
Okay.
Aloha.
Aloha.